exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
Broadcast from later, we're discussing weak signals of change. These are events and phenomena we notice and suspect may influence futures. I'm Robert Bolton, joined today by Erica White, Valdez Sillins, our producer, Jeremy Glenn, Serena Choi is here as well, and welcoming Winnipeg's own Dr. Irwin Adam, food futurist, a PhD in microfluidics and organ-on-a-chip technology, the creative director of the Future Food Studio, and a friend and collaborator. What's up, Irwin?
How's it going? I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, man, thanks for coming. Irwin, want to tell us a little bit about background? I'm thinking, where do we want to start? But maybe Future Food Studio. Want to tell us what that's been about?
Yeah, so Future Food Studio has really been a project of mine that exists at the intersection of the things that I kind of love, which are food, design, and technology. Really, what we've been doing over the last 8 years is exploring what the tomorrow of food interaction, experience, and engagement will look like. And that's at every level, from policy to robotics to sitting at a dining table to art to actually the foods that we eat. Yeah, so it's been an adventure in immersive art, in strategy and foresight, in retail and in product, and really everywhere that food happens. That's kind of where we've shown up.
My favorite thing was when you carbonated a half grapefruit for me. It was a phenomenal thing, but some of it was just like fun stuff. It was like, it was your hobby first and became a very professionalized hustle.
Yeah, it's been a cool balance between just like absolute play. You know, I have a background in academia. I have a PhD in biomedical engineering. And so I got to bring a lot of kind of laboratory stuff that was pretty serious to this place of food and just have fun with it. And yeah, so you ended up with things like carbonated half grapefruits, but you also had edible clouds. We built projects around tasting data. Really, like, you know, creating utensils that can actually simulate taste in the mouth. And so really looking at this intersection of food, design, and technology and trying to expand like what's possible when those things meet.
For sure. One thing I remember, the first time we met, we were in Purchase, New York. Shout out Scarsdale. We were at PepsiCo, and we probably can't talk about that much of it, but you isolated all the flavors of Pepsi into a cloud, which was way more flavors than I knew. Are those top secret? Can we not talk about that right now?
I have no idea, but we can just say like what's available widely on the internet are different flavors of Pepsi. And it was surprising, you know, you have things like cinnamon and orange and lemon and lavender, and you had all these 8 different flavors that we don't really associate with Pepsi, but when you know that they're there, you start noticing them. And so that's what we did, is we deconstructed the beverage into all of its base flavor profiles. And in order to go another step further and really give us a way to reimagine this beverage that we're all familiar with, we deconstructed the liquid form of it as well. And that's really what led to the creation of these edible clouds, right? So it was deconstructing the actual flavor into components, but then also deconstructing phase. The overarching theme throughout all of the work that we've done has been using this modality of joy and delight, or something that I think, Rob, you actually came up with, this pleasurable disorientation, in order to create moments of pause that allow people to become a little bit more conscious around their behaviors, give them a moment of pause so that they can actually think about what's going on around them.
It was, I mean, it definitely did the trick. I don't know. It's like, I keep bringing up that grapefruit like it was just some novelty thing or something, but no, it very much like is one of many of these things that succeeded, and not your most conceptual of all the works you've done.
No, but I think that's important though, is that the gestures don't have to be big. Yeah. Right. So like often we think that we have to make these big, ginormous gestures in order to have impact, in order to actually get people to experience their world differently, to shift their paradigms. But I think what we found was actually, it was the more nuanced, the more simple things that, you know, open people up to a new world of food and eating.
So I've realized I've like happened into a process of we're going to go backwards through your past and then jump maybe back to what you're into right now. But prior to that, you were at U of T.
Yeah. So my PhD research essentially the way that I ended up in the lab that I ended up in was I was very interested in studying things at the micro scale, so at the cellular scale. So my PhD research focused on microfluidics and specifically lab on chip technology. So the idea being, how do we take all the equipment of a laboratory, that costs millions of dollars, and reduce it to something the size of a credit card that costs us $100. So specifically, my work used a technology called digital microfluidics, where I could use electric fields to move tiny droplets of liquids in order to perform all these different laboratory processes. And where I was applying that technology was in personalized medicine. An example being, folks who might have cancer, they have to undergo treatments, right? And physicians aren't always able to predict what the best treatment will be for a specific type of cancer. So the platform I built allowed me to take a biopsy sample from a patient and grow it up in 3 dimensions on this chip and actually test some of those chemotherapeutic drugs to see which would be the most effective in preventing, the proliferation of these cancers. And another cool space where we were working with it was, at that time, stem cell biology was really, really proliferating. And we'd actually learned at that time from a group in Japan how we could take any cell type of the body and turn it back into an embryonic stem cell-like cell. And so what I was doing was I was able to take skin cells from patients, put them onto my device, and actually turn them back into stem cells and then differentiate those out into the different cell types. So, you could have the patient's heart cells, their brain cells, their liver cells or whatnot on this single device. But why that's super critical is that then that would allow you to screen drugs across an individual's specific tissues and see how that person would respond to drugs. Right. So, and that was like one of the goals of personalized medicine, right? Because right now, we use medicine in a way that's premised on clinical trials. So we just, take a large cross section of society and we say everybody's basically going to respond this way, but it's really just a game of averages because people obviously are quite diverse. So the more personalized we can get, obviously, the better.
True. And even, I guess, going back further, that's like the work you were doing in, I guess, mostly U of T, but also Harvard and elsewhere where you were.
Yeah, so that was divided between University of Toronto, Harvard, and École Normale in Paris. So it's kind of my rotation there.
Shout out Ipe, shout out Lian Lang's fashion blog, and anyone else I met through your lab work. And then going back further, then McGill, right? One of the things that you and I have bonded over in our intellectual approaches to problem solving, if we can call them intellectual, was DIMS. Can you break down DIMS? Everybody here has heard me preach DIMS hard and what it is and why it's so foundational. And I know Valdez at least has expanded on it recently, and I've shared that with you.
So DIMS is a pretty serious analytical framework that I acquired during my undergraduate days in chemical engineering at McGill. And it comes from first-year physics professor I had at the time, Sang-Young John, who would challenge us in engineering physics to look at our work and look at the responses to all of our questions and ask ourselves DIMS. And that acronym, became really important through every aspect of my life. And then professionally has been really important. And it really simply stands for, does it make sense? And it is wild when you start bringing that into your life as a framework, because just every moment, everything you hear on the news, everything you see in the things that you're writing, everything that people are saying to you, suddenly you put them through this filter of, does it make sense? And often the answer is no. And so that's become like a guiding principle. And it's really funny that it just came from this first year physics class, but yeah, it's become really, really important in a lot of the work that we do.
I mean, it was exactly as you described for me, totally eye-opening for changing things and even just reviewing, editing things. I mean, it's really a validation framework, and Valdez added to it recently. It was the sort of front end of that before, as you're starting to identify the problem space. I can tell you don't even remember it. It was WGO, I think. What's going on? Valdez said Marvin Gaye had it right. But I don't know, Valdez, it might be self-explanatory enough, but do you care to elaborate more on the what's going on side of the, I think, the opening of the double diamond?
It's funny that I can't like share the image because I just made like a little graphic that probably just is a lot faster at getting what the process was. But the what's going on question just came from like thinking about strategy and how so much of what people do when they're actually engaged in strategy is just trying to figure out what's actually happening. That's like the hardest thing to figure out. It's not even what to do emerges kind of naturally once you figure out what's going on, right? And you can make all kinds of like complex approaches and plans, and then you do the kind of DIMS question. That's how I see it. Like you kind of ask after a few steps, you're like, okay, wait, does this actually make any sense? You know, if it doesn't, you can like go back to like what's going on and try to figure out what's actually happening in the situation.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And then Irwin and I were joking that like the last step is like, it's what's going on, does it make sense? And then no one cares. Which is just basically an acknowledgement that like, yeah, you can try and be as logical as you want, but people are, you know, feeling their way through things and having their feelings and opinions, and whether it makes sense or not, according to your logic, may be irrelevant.
I interpret it as meaning that like organizations have incentives that are just different from actually trying to figure out what's going on. I thought that's what you're saying.
Or does it make sense?
Like no one cared. Yeah. What's that?
Or does it make sense?
Yeah.
Does it make dollars is more the organization framework.
Yeah.
And then Irwin, you feel like talking about epigenetics, or do you want to just talk about like what's interesting to you now?
There's so many things that are interesting to me now. I think the things that are most present for me right now, you know, in my career, across the course of my career, the red thread has really been this exploration of the ways in which we transform our environment and how the environment transforms us in return. And so that really, you know, started at the cellular level, studying stem cell biology and looking at microenvironments. And so, you know, you have these little cells that are fixing up their environment around them, and that environment is instructing them what to become. And then that's all the way up to like spaces and places, you know, having built museums and retail spaces and really witnessed the ways in which architecture and design at the human scale or larger than human scale genuinely influences our behaviors. And then you can absolutely go to the most macro of the global scale. You know, obviously my platform is food, but it's become so evident the ways in which we consume food transforms us, but also those choices we make around food consumption is clearly transforming the world around us. You know, climate change, you know, land usage, all these different questions that have arisen over the last 2 years, particularly, are getting really reified. I think have been reified throughout COVID. So, you know, this red thread of like the ways I'm transformed by the world around me and the ways I transform the world around me has been really important. And so central to all of that is epigenetics, right? Epigenetics is essentially the study of the code that controls the code, right? So we can appreciate that every cell in our body has the same blueprint, DNA, right? But that DNA is being used differently. So that's why I have an eyeball and I have a toe and I have a nose. So though the DNA is the same in every part of my body, that DNA is just a blueprint, but then has to be put into effect. And the thing that controls how the DNA is used is this thing we call the epigenome. Epi being on top of, genome, obviously the genome. And so that's become really interesting to me because all these things that I've studied over my career seem to converge at the space of the epigenome. And so now, you know, I've been actively pursuing a project trying to explore more how we can have more access to evaluating the epigenome, both for ourselves as humans, but then also for the things that we consume. So that's been pretty exciting. And really just, you know, that message that we can transform ourselves at a genetic scale is pretty wild.
Yeah. So this maybe feels like too clean of an analogy to me, and you tell me if it passes DIMS or not, but between doing the food research, like it's kind of like cooking, like the idea that a genome is like a recipe. And when you bring in this like epi, this is like process, this is like touch, this is like having, you know, it like actually, you know, how you use your tools and how much time you put something in for, and like not just following the directions exactly, but having the chef's touch, right? It has that effect on the end result.
That's exactly it. It's right. You have the recipe, But at the end of the day, the meal will be a product of the ingredients you actually have on hand, the techniques that you have, the tools that you have. So it doesn't matter that the recipe exists. The recipe kind of just potentiates what's available or what's possible. But at the end of the day, the mechanics of technique, tools, and ingredients are actually going to decide what the meal looks like. And that's exactly how epigenetics transforms us from the DNA to kind of the body that you are.
Right. Cool. All right. Well, this feels like a good time to transfer. Erica, are you down to go first?
Yeah. So I guess my signal this round, just surrounding if we really think that generated illustrations or GAN, sorry, I always call it GAN, will remove the need for illustrators. So there seems to be a lot of tension around what will happen to artists or art or creativity after the release of DALL-E 2 by OpenAI. So DALL-E 2 is this machine learning tool that creates realistic images out of text. So you can just input, say, a banana with a wig or like a teacup with eyes, and it will generate some image, some illustration or image that resembles that. And so I'm just curious to know if people have heard of this and what the actual hype around it is, because I'm mostly seeing the usual AI will completely kill or change visual arts. And I kind of want to like stress test a little bit to know if that's true.
Interesting. I feel like I have opinions on this stuff, but maybe not up to date with the current like conversation. Can you maybe talk a bit more about like what you're seeing? Like, what are people saying right now? Do you feel like there's like legit people making that claim that like, oh, it's over for illustrators? And are those people illustrators or not?
Just from what I've seen, it's fairly impressive that, you can say a few lines of text and this tool will generate some imagery and variations of that imagery for you. So at like a commercial level, I feel like it's actually quite applicable and usable, but whether that removes the need for an illustrator is quite different. People are saying that the panic around a tool like this is actually comparable to the same panic that happened when people were like, oh, cameras are going to destroy painting, or digital cameras are going to destroy like more tactile practices or of like drawing and what have you. But yeah, I guess this is different just because the machine is actually producing the artwork. So it's not like when you work with like a digital tool, like a camera, like you're taking a picture of something and there's some sort of like professionalization behind it, some sort of like craftsmanship behind it. But with this, I think it's slightly different just because you're feeding a machine learning model a bunch of images or data sets, and then it's coming up with something out of that. So it just feels a little different than using a tool like a digital camera or like a sewing machine or something.
Interesting. There's like so many different ways to think about it. I mean, I kind of want to start by just going back and to the camera's point. And if the people who are comparing the two, I presume they're saying painting didn't die. Is that like painting persists?
Yeah, that like craftsmanship persists. That's sculpting and painting. They still have like a need behind them because people want like a more human person, not human perspective, but like they want something that's made from someone, and there's something special and interesting about that.
Right. I mean, just to take the other side on that, could we say that maybe painting it is kind of dead, like compared to where it would be were it not for the camera? Because I don't think there are that many people dedicating their entire lives to that level of craft painting that there once were. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but it seems to me that to be an artist, most of the like professional artists today are using every medium and are not masters in the same way of one thing like painting, the way that they might have once been. So it's funny, like I probably would have been one of those people making that argument about it won't go away, like things will still exist, and it does exist, but it's not probably what it was, what it could be if we had that. If it weren't for something like the camera coming in. But is that bad? I don't think it's bad.
I would wonder as well if like when the camera came in, if that actually helped instigate the shift away from figurative painting, right? Like before, figurative painting was obviously like just that was the work, you know, you paint people's faces, you paint portraits and whatnot. But then suddenly you have, you know, the adoption of photography. And that's where I think a bit of like that divergence from figurative starts happening as we start getting to like, you know, more abstract and modernist and whatnot. I don't know if that's a fact, but I wonder if in some ways these kinds of new generation tools or technologies actually instigate a shift in the art form rather than eroding it or cannibalizing it.
I think there's something to that. I mean, that kind of also brought me to the same point on this. If you think about like one particular job of an illustrator, right? And let's say that their job is to create an illustration for some sort of editorial piece or something, like for an essay or something that's in whatever, in the Atlantic, or a cover story for the New Yorker or whatever. So let's say that you can now imitate that artist's style perfectly and, you know, describe what you would want it to draw. In a lot of those cases, it's like, it's pretty particular what is making meaning there. You know, it's like a particular perspective that's given of whatever. It's not just like we can represent these objects beautifully or in a cool style. It's like, it's choices that are made, right? Like sort of editorial choices. Like we're looking at a person from the point of view of a plant, or something that sounds like something we would talk about. But to type that in is a pretty, you know, you're solving the creative problem there, even if it can be executed. So I wonder if there's, you know, something to that, and maybe there's more with the human touch. But yeah, I just wonder if what we'll have is people getting more brilliant at kind of putting things in an interesting context and like doing juxtaposition and getting more specific about exactly what's in the painting and what angles it's shown from and what way it's done, you know, because it's faster to simply do the representation work of like generating the image.
Yeah. And just like looping that into what you were mentioning, Irwin, about figurative art, is that an artist might say that today the most important part of an illustration or drawing is actually picking that reference image. And that's kind of the process, I think, that happens in using a tool like DALL-E or something, that there's like these reference images and you're constantly producing all these different iterations towards a certain goal or label that is considered what that thing should look like. So if it's a cup, you're constantly trying to like generate something that looks like figuratively like a cup, if that makes sense.
Something that comes to mind as well, and it's not directly connected, but I remember probably about 7-8 years ago when IBM was like, you know, putting Deep Blue onto all kinds of projects, where they had IBM and Watson going. There was a big IBM Watson food initiative where they had this like, you know, presumably AI generated chef happening online. And suddenly, you know, there was this thinking that Watson would have the ability to create all these new types of recipes and it would be amazing. And we wouldn't really need chefs anymore. In order to create, we could just have people interpret what was created by Watson. And it didn't work. Like it didn't.
Others and I might have been responsible for perpetuating some of that briefly in 2015 or something. Anyway, sorry.
Right, like it didn't fully work, you know. Like, and we did some work with them too, and at the end of the day, the outputs did not pass DIMS analysis. They really did not pass the DIMS.
Oh, you just didn't know how to make it properly. You know, you didn't have the touch for what Watson was supposing.
I think the problem is those models that you like, machine learning is using like inductive statistical models. I don't think, even if we were talking about like a text model, like not the DALL-Es, but like whatever like the good language model is of the day.
GPT something. Oh, there's another better one.
Yeah, 8 or whatever. I don't think it'd be good at producing new words, because what words are linked to things in the world. They're not actually like in this ethereal realm of just like symbols. It's actually the interface between like things and symbols. That's like what a word is and what word does. It kind of has this referential quality. Even if it's an abstract term, it's the abstractions are still part of the world. And so to generate a new word, it has to actually like make a decision about what is relevant to draw attention to. And that's the part that I'm like, I don't think these machine learning models that are just based on like inductive statistical work, they're great at reproducing what we've already noticed, because those are patterns and you can use induction to figure that out, but they can't actually make a leap and determine, hey, combining these two words together is actually going to be significant for humans because XYZ in the world is like happening. And, you know, that's what a word does. It draws attention to that, whether it's a feeling or an abstraction or a thing in the world, like it kind of pulls your attention there. And basically, I don't think these like machine learning models have anything in terms of like generating novelty, but it doesn't mean I don't think they're not interesting.
But also, yeah, and it's like a different process that requires a human on the other end. Like, I don't know, I years ago wrote like this thing about this idea that Bob Dylan creates an album using a whole bunch of AI tools to improve his voice and to do that. But the more interesting one of them all was the writing. And so someone like Bob Dylan, whose work is full of certain types of illusions across everything, if you were to sort of figure out a way to train it in the style of Bob Dylan, and to feed it with the would-be references, because there's a lot of hijacking that went on as well, right, within Bob Dylan's writing from all over culture, from like, you know, Zen Buddhism to Dylan Thomas to whatever. You know, you might be able to get some sort of output where it's like, oh, this is something Bob Dylan would reference and it's written in the style, and though like, you know, the whole output might not be worth anything, the right person looking at it and picking and choosing could be quite interesting. And like those types of collaborative relationships, I think can be cool for sort of augmenting your writing or something like that. I think there's some potential there.
Like, who is it for? I mean, I feel like most people who are producing art are making it for either, they might be making it for themselves, but like generally speaking, like this stuff is aimed at an audience, you know, like there's like intention. And that's what I don't see from this, right? It's like, okay, well, there's an intention to create something from the person who typed the words in, but I don't know, like, I feel like there's no connectivity.
Yeah, but presumably in the case I came up with, it's for Bob Dylan fans. And like maybe the person's like, if you're just hitting writer's block or something and you just feed it with your own writing and put in a new topic or something, you know?
As like an additional tool to like hone your craft or something, or like evaluate like the quality or something like that. I think I get that. But as far as like replacing like a whole industry, I don't know. Unless what you're looking for is the perspective of this artist plus AI, then I don't know who the audience is, right? Like that's all I'm saying. I'm not sure that it connects in the same way.
When you look at the ways people have, you know, dealt with like essentially AIs that sort of optimized and stuff in the past, it's like, look at, you know, what T-Pain did with auto-tune, right? It's like all the best examples are like people just being like, oh, let me just use this wrong, like, and and like make something amazing, you know, which is like, then we have 808s and Heartbreak, whatever, you know.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say. What media almost isn't generated at some degree now. Like you get like a AAA movie or something, and everything has CGI and they've done overlays and what have you. But just for an example of like who's perhaps using it, I read the other day, and this is definitely more of a pop culture reference, but someone was just using generative text and AI to see what the Twilight characters would look like just from the text rather than what they actually ended up being in the movie. And people are doing this all the time with like historical figures, like making like statues, actual like what they would actually look like as real people, or cartoon characters, like what they would look like more realistically. So that's where I'm like, yeah, I can see that being like the evolution of animation in some way. But again, Rob, when you were mentioning like certain artists in the style of reproducing the style of their work, I guess that also puts into question like what are the inputs based off of, and could it again change copyright laws or something? Like kind of what OpenAI is founded on. OpenAI is founded on like these are open data sets, but does that cause ground for I don't know, like different copyright laws on something like Bob Dylan's voice or
lyrical style or something, or like Stranger? Yeah.
Or does it open grounds for that? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. Signal to noise. Irwin, you want to go first?
I think there's a signal there. I don't think it's what we're talking about, though. I don't think the things that we're touching on are actually what the signal's about.
Do you think you know, or you think we just don't know?
Something that came up for me from listening to Valdez is actually this question of like, well, what's missing in the AI system, right? Like what is actually missing that's making it not have this human component? And, you know, I have a meditation practice and, you know, study Vipassana and whatnot. And a lot of the theory there, it's interesting to go to that type of a framework, but a lot of that theory is premised on the only thing that's real is sensation in the body. And Valdez, when you were talking about, you know, the words and just like the way it strings them together, I think ultimately that's the piece that's missing, is the AI is not predictive of the sensation we're experiencing in the body, right? So like it can understand the words, it can understand other contexts that the words have existed in, but it can't necessarily understand the sensation created within the context of that moment that those words have. And so, you know, if I were to think about models here and the signals, like I think the signal is more along the lines of refinement of these systems and actually what's missing in these systems rather than what are they going to erode.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, I think that's a big part of the difference, but I still wonder, like, will it matter to audiences? Like, will it matter when you see something if it makes something either hilarious or moving or whatever, and it does so in a way that we don't like understand? It may, though, you know.
I don't know how you're going to take this, but like, so I take myself to be like somewhat of an empiricist. Like, I think I agree with this idea that sensations are the way that we come to know things. It's through the senses that we learn. But to put a radical spin on it, like words are sensations too, and they do things, right? They do cause, like me speaking over Zoom, you know, I can cause somebody to laugh somewhere halfway across the world or cry or whatever, right? And so physically it has a kind of reaction, and there's like a chain of sensations that cause that to take place. In like a language model, again, physically there are like things happening in the chips, right? There's movement occurring, there's sensation occurring in that sense, right? And so those patterns of sensation, that's what that word is to the model, is like a pattern of electrons in a chip. And so it does have a kind of version of it, but I think the difference obviously is that it doesn't have our senses whatsoever. So it doesn't move in the world, it doesn't have pain, it doesn't have death, it doesn't have hunger, it doesn't have anything like that. All it has are these weird word sensations. So I don't know, that's the part where I'm kind of like, where it gets fun, you know, because what does it mean to interact with a certain kind of intelligence, if you want to call it that, that like just is so different from us, but sort of mimics us in ways, or has learned through us, you know? It's kind of this weird Frankenstein offspring, you know, of just like some part of us. Yeah.
There's a book that came out from the author who wrote The Martian called The Hail Mary that's been really making rounds recently. And the whole premise is this like whatever scientist from Earth has to go figure out this new organism in space that's destroying the sun. And when he gets there, he encounters an alien life form who's also on the same mission for his planet. And the alien life form has like evolved kind of in parallel to the way humans have evolved, but completely differently. And so one of the big things is that the alien life form has no sense of sight, has no vision, and everything it experiences in the world around it is through sound. And it experiences sound across its entire form. And it's kind of this like spider type creature that just experiences sound on all of its body. It's really cool because actually just hearing you right now about this, it's exactly that. It's like, how are we going to interpret our experiences of this like lived world or this lived experience? How are we going to interpret that and share that with these other intelligences that don't have the same lived experience, but are having a unique experience that is also valuable and we can learn from?
It's so funny. I mean, just hearing that, and I'm like, you're talking about like all the other plants and animals, right? Like, this is what we do, right? We're sharing,
right? Like,
I don't know. I think Valdez taught me the term biosemiotics. Have you ever come across that before, Irwin?
No.
I think it's biosemiotics. It's essentially just like the ways that other animals and I guess plants and whatever else are interpreting signs and things like that, including the ones that are like us walking, like what the pigeon thinks when we're walking down the street or whatever. And like we have disrupted some of those other like sensory environments in ways like we've disrupted the ones that we sense enough. But like when you think of like magnetic fields and things like that other species are sensing, it's just like how are they making sense of all of that noise or signal?
It reminds me of how hummingbirds actually capture, say, a field. It's more than just looking at like every single flower in the field. They're actually capturing like a sensory palette that's beyond that. They know exactly what each flower they've hit up. And that's not just based off of visual cues. That's like much more fine-tuned and granular and based off of just what a hummingbird can capture. And that's kind of, it's a little different from the alien analogy, but it is definitely another way to look at like how you would capture like any kind of scenery and what that even means to you. Like it's based off of their taste, it's based off of what they're hearing, and yeah, it's a much deeper palette of like a sensorium of things going on.
I don't like the thought experiments that are like, oh, what if this AI became sentient, blah blah blah. It's just like there's no sign of like even the first steps of something like that. But what there is like you have to ask like, what are those things that like it is sensing? And it's basically like our past, right? That's what it's accessing. So it's this weird like entity. It's not alive, but it's kind of like a version of a very particular version of the past, the one that's accessible like through whatever like technique they use to generate that model, which is like, I don't know, they use in like the text editing ones, they usually use like Reddit links to figure out how to scan the internet to get enough like words to make a model. I don't know what they did with the images, but basically it's like that snapshot of a certain moment of our past. And so this becomes a tool to kind of like dive into that collective planetary memory and like explore what happens when you kind of like ping it with things, you know, like that's what it is. It's not alive, it's just like it's part of our memory, you know.
Yeah, that's interesting. For you, Valdez, signal and noise,
I guess for those reasons, signal.
you could go,
but like will it replace illustrators? Probably no. It'll probably be something that's like incorporated into PowerPoint and makes it easier to like, you know, make a quick like image.
Clippy. It's like Clippy was sentient. You can't prove he wasn't. Even though when you say those things like it's not alive, and that's something I've been like, I'm less and less certain that I have any idea what constitutes something being alive or not. But so signal, unanimous signal, it sounds like. Irwin, what's your weakest signal?
I think my weakest signal is babies. Is the how I'm going to start this off with. And as I look into the news environment, the tech environment, there's just so much around babies that just keeps emerging for me. You know, there's a lot of these like smart home technologies, and they've obviously been now shifted over into baby tech. So you have a lot of these monitoring systems for your kid. And a lot of these smart monitoring systems now, they actually kind of, they watch your kid and they're able to evaluate through image analysis your child's breathing patterns, right? And the reason why that's important is because little infants, when they're in a crib, not many of them, it's like 1 to 5% of them might experience some form of apnea, basically pauses in breathing. And, you know, that can be an indication for essentially something like sudden infant death syndrome. And so, you know, you have all these parents installing all these devices all over the place, monitoring their babies. And at a scientific level, there actually isn't the strongest correlation between that data set and actually preventing SIDS. But what is interesting, and this is somewhat anecdotal, somewhat reported, is that these monitoring systems, because they're continually uploading data to some central organism, let's call it, some central thought collector, it's picking up a lot of data that was unexpected. And that has to do with a lot of the sounds that babies are making. So that was never really what was being looked at. But now there's like this huge data set around baby sounds, and people evaluating those baby sounds and actually looking at those noises as prognostics for potential pathologies or behavioral things that are happening on. And so this actually leads to the actual signal, which is this notion of serendipitous data, right? We're monitoring data with all these sensors now, and we don't really have a way to understand super clearly yet, like what the impact of that data is. And I was then like kind of diving deeper into this. There's a book written kind of about this, where a lot of like correlations were starting to be made through like random data with end results, right? And it remains that question of like, does that observation actually lead to the result, or are they just correlations? But some of the interesting ones are like, when they look at people typing in credit applications, folks who use proper punctuation and capitalization tend to be better borrowers. And, is that correlation or causation? Unknown. But, the thinking then there is like, potentially people who like to follow rules in this case, they also like to follow rules in this other case. There's other pieces of data that have just emerged, and these come from a lot of the big companies out there. Employees who use Firefox and Chrome tend to perform better in this kind of front office and right, and you start looking at all these weird data sets. And ultimately, I guess my observation here, the signal is just around the serendipity in data and how we're going to, and I don't understand it really, but how we're going to actually probe this randomness of data in the sculpting of tomorrow, like in the sculpting of our tomorrow behaviors.
I'd love it as a signal, but just to go back, I feel like I cut you off on the Firefox Chrome. That if I'm thinking of the right thing, that was an older study that basically was like, if you kind of before Chrome was as commonly used as it is now, it was like if you're using Firefox or Chrome and not just using the thing that your computer comes with, you're more likely to be sort of like a maverick or something, like a creative leader or something like that. Yeah,
exactly.
And it's not a causation thing at all. It's just like you're someone who goes out and picks their browser versus accepting one.
Yeah, it's exactly that. I think there was a book written about this, the topic of these data sets and like trying to understand what they mean. It was called Predictive Analytics, the Power to Predict Who Will Click, Buy, Lie, or Die, written by Eric Siegel. And, that's like obviously being used in like this traditional kind of marketing setting. But how are we actually going to use that moving forward? Like we're having the conversation around epigenetics, and the United States has laws right now enacted around the usage of genomic data, right? There is no rule around epigenetic data. We'll assume that it'll act the same way, but right now you're not allowed to have any prejudice or bias or use someone's genomic data as an evaluator of them, right? So that means you can't decide their credit worthiness using that. You can't decide their ability to qualify for health insurance, their ability to qualify for a job. You can't use their genetic data to do that.
Wait, are they allowed to use your grammar to affect whether they give you a loan?
That's exactly the question, is like, how many arbitrary data sets are there out there that are playing into an algorithm that perhaps we're not even aware of, and how those serendipitous data sets are actually sculpting our lives today and kind of the way we live tomorrow. And like, is that real? Like, or is that kind of just a bullshit thing? Or are these just random kind of quirky data sets that are being noticed and they kind of just die there?
And that's the common thing with all those examples, is like no one was studying this, right? As the idea. This was just like somehow they had both pieces.
It was just noted, like someone's like,
noticed it.
Exactly. Yeah.
What you were kind of getting at is, where does this go about whether it's sculpting us? And I don't know, I'm sort of tempted to go into like, what's the most exciting type of thing? I don't even know how to speculate on this exactly. Like, what's the data, like the weirdest data set where we might be picking up essentially noise? It's actually, noise is kind of an interesting term to be using with this, because that noise in sort of in an information theory sense, like that, it's something, right? Like it's not like, it's just when you call it noise, that's just your own determination about it. But
we run the risk of like interpreting noise as something, right? Like we always run this risk of saying like, oh, like I'm noticing this, I am having this observation here. and there's a lot of fallacies that can exist in that connection of that observation to a result. And, we have all the different biases that exist, but it does seem more and more that there is value in this noise because we are collecting, like at the most fundamental level, we're just collecting so much data. Like there's just so much information. And, how are we deciding how to wade through it? Like, how are we making our movements through it? Right. Like for anything as basic as just like I'm sitting just outside an intersection right now that has a speeding cameras attached to it, right? Just that alone is generating so much data. And right now it's mostly just being interpreted as this person driving this car. Actually, it's just this car with this license plate was speeding or went through this red light, send them a ticket. But when does that start connecting to what can we extrapolate from that? Like, is there a certain type of car, a certain type of person that is behaving in a certain way? How does that connect? In a place like Manitoba, where I am right now, we have public insurance. So having that information can actually very easily dictate, hey, like we should actually charge those people more for their insurance because they're acting recklessly in general, and just I'm trying to make sense of it. It's not super clear to me, like how these things actually evolve, but there really is a lot of capture happening.
We've had some conversations recently about like what the future sports book looks like, and in light of like there just being so much more data that you could start to produce odds about so many more happenings in the world, and like certainly on like biometric stuff. Like if you're watching like an NBA game, because of the analytics that they have now, like rather than betting on the outcome, you could start betting on like the average top speed of the point guard or something like that over the course of a game, and like have an over under on that or something like that. And there's just like these weird things that are getting picked up for whatever reason. But I wonder, as you said, the red card thing, it's like, should we just bet on like like we have odds on like how likely it is that a red car is going to turn the corner next, and we could start to like gamble on that. And let's say this obviously in a moment where it's like you can't like turn around in this city now without seeing like an advertisement for gambling. And it's just sort of, we've called it the gamification among our team. And been doing a lot of shout outs today, but shout out Sid, who kind of brought this topic to us in the first place.
My background is partly in the real estate industry. And one of the things you're dealing with there, and it's being dealt with a lot right now, are like credit scores, credit checks, and just checks in general. And it's really hard to like use the data that's currently at your fingertips to accurately gauge what someone's like. And there is a company called Neighborly, which tries to use social scores to get a better understanding of what the credit worthiness, or like, I guess, like what's the personality of this potential tenant. It's usually in a tenancy situation that you're looking at these things. And so I wonder whether this kind of like serendipitous data could be helpful in those kinds of instances, because the two credit institutions that are used are in Canada anywhere are Equifax and TransUnion. And both of them have had huge data hacking situations. And I've talked to, at least like anecdotally, I've talked to at least a few friends who've had issues with Equifax in particular, where they'll just say, that's not you. Like based on what we have here, the information we have doesn't corroborate that you are the same person that's applying for this tenancy or whatever.
Excuse me, I was a victim of identity fraud, most likely caused by you. Losing my data. Yeah.
At the moment, right, it doesn't really work very well. And, like a good case in point is like a client that we had very good credit score, like everything looked above board, and is now like embroiled in legal issues with this client that we had because of, various things. But it's so hard to know, like there's no personality gauge. And, you're just saying like, have you paid your bills on time? Yeah, you're credit worthy, but what's your personality like? Like, how do you, and so this Neighborly thing kind of goes in.
But also, are you using Oxford commas? You have periods at the end of sentences, capital letters. And
what could it do though, right? It could actually work in the worst way.
For sure. Although it's interesting hearing about like social scores like that, because it's like I feel like generally there's just this sort of like social score is bad happening in China, that like narrative. And it's like, well, it can be used in a lot of ways to advocate on behalf of people who otherwise are getting shut down by like circumstances beyond their control or whatever, and make people more able to. Although I wonder, it's like, do you need to be like spying on people? Can you not just like get a couple of neighbors to vouch for you or something? Like, shouldn't things like that be enough to build trust with those sorts of credit organizations and get to decide?
I think the thing, Cher, you were just talking about is interesting, but slightly different from what I would see as like the point of the serendipity idea of like actually discovering not just like commercial truths or like social truths about people, but like scientific ones or something like that. Or this is where I was taking it. And so I was like, I think a lot of the question of like the data we make, we don't often, there isn't a discussion around like data design, like why, what are we collecting and why? So a lot of it's just like kind of just stupid. I would call it kind of just like not very useful at some like big civilizational scale data around like transactions and things like that. But what are people looking at that maybe we wouldn't have known about before? And so like the bird tracking data is really cool. So like birds were like, oddly enough, like until a few years ago, we didn't even know where most birds went. Like there was just no way. Like you would have to stick like a little physical thing on the, I don't know what they're called, the legs, tag and whatnot, right? But you couldn't, that couldn't be tracked in real time. That was just like if you were lucky enough and they died somewhere and you could pick it up, you know, or if you caught it again somewhere. And so like putting these digital trackers and tracking in real time bird movement patterns is just like totally transformed the field of like ornithology and like how they actually migrate and move. And so things like that, camera traps like in wildlife have apparently been like really important for kind of trying to figure out what animals are up to. I think there's like a whole like eco digital overlap that could be very, I don't know what to call it, like productive for science or something like that, beyond just like narcissistically directing all the data at ourselves. And like in the scale of things, are they that interesting?
I guess like figuring out what's interesting is kind of key to like what can be done with this, right? It's like I'm sort of thinking of like there's a, I think a Malcolm Gladwell-ish career to be had in like getting really good at having an awareness of like what data sets are out there and like what serendipitous data sets are being collected, sort of the accidental data sets within those, and like knowing how to properly comb those collections as a skill set and identify what's actually interesting about it so that you can, you know, find out the weird tidbit that's like that whatever data scientist may be left as a marginal note about how your grammar affects your likelihood to pay back your loans or what browser, that kind of thing. Like these are all, that's why I say Gladwell is like, these are all Malcolm Gladwell articles essentially. Like that's the sort of type of point that's being made out of these elements. But could someone get good at that? And is it just journalists like who are looking for curious things? Is it like, who are the people who work in that field? Off the top of my head, I wouldn't know that I'm convinced most people who work in those fields are best equipped to like see the promise in the stuff that's not what they're looking at, because they're looking at it for a particular thing usually. How do we get good at that?
Who's the gatekeeper like of that question, right? Like that's like, because in a way we're saying you have to know what the question is in order to find the correlation in some regards. And a lot of like the corporate approach, that's kind of what it is. It's like you're kind of, you know what you're looking for as the outcome. And so you kind of know what to hunt for. But in the true serendipitous moments, like, yeah, like how do you find it? Like, how do you find it? And I guess, yeah, like, is there a specific skill set for actually combing through that? And it's like, is it really just a data science thing that you just feed in the garble and you say, hey, let's run a correlation on this, correlation analysis, and just see like, what are the factors that emerge?
Because so often someone's looking to like make a certain argument when they're doing a study in the first place, or, right. You know, so it's easy to be blind to certain things. I mean, there's tons of biases around that. It's related, but somewhat different.
And all of you were kind of parsing what is the skill set there. I'm like, it almost takes like a little bit of like, not a traditional detective type of title of work, but like someone who's going to look at the outliers in like a data set. And maybe that's a little different from like the consumer kind of gatekeeper. Maybe that's what juxtaposes the consumer gatekeeper kind of perspective in how we shape or form or design and work with data.
I think that's interesting. I mean, just, yeah, forensic architecture, archaeology, there's like a bunch of these sort of like digging and identifying things. And I don't know, it's interesting that you brought up serendipitous too, because yeah, I don't know if it's a confusing, is this your phrase, the serendipitous data sets, I guess is what it.
Yeah, it's kind of just the thing that makes sense for these unintentional findings.
Yeah, the accident that it even exists in some cases. And I guess there's a whole spectrum, right? In terms of like how intentional, like it might have been something they were intentionally collecting, but the types of relationships that are being drawn is more serendipitous. But it also might be like, no, that's not what they were meaning to collect at all, but they have it.
You know how in the social sciences, there's like been this whole decade-long like kerfuffle around like p-hacking and the replicability crisis, because basically all of these like social scientists were doing statistics in a way that was like quite sloppy and resulting in the kind of like bad correlation stuff that I think Irwin was kind of like hinting at. And they basically had to like reset themselves on like new footing. And there was an article last week that went around like discussing how like one of the big things that's happened is that there's been a much stronger emphasis on having a strong conceptual model of what's happening in the situation before looking for correlations, right? So if you go into a data set just being like, oh, what's linked and like what's connected, like you'll end up following all these kind of false paths. But if you have already like a conceptual model and you have certain hunches and you go in looking through the data set with those hunches in mind, they're not necessarily like hypotheses yet. They're just kind of like, you can still use the data creatively and look for stuff that you didn't know was there, but to actually have like a model of what's happening is like very necessary.
Yeah, makes sense. Is there an article out there that you know of where like someone has kind of listed like, here's 5 of these weird findings or whatever from serendipitous data sets?
So the guy from that book, like he has one article as I was diving into, it's like 9 bizarre and surprising insights from data science. And this is like from 2016. You know, this has been something that's been ongoing for a while. It's like where like we know that there's these weird observations that happen, but the actionable components haven't really been there. And so now we're in a moment where I think there could be a lot of behind the scenes action happening that we're not necessarily aware of. And then there's also like choices around action, right? So like in one way, you know, Valdez, to your point around like, yeah, like there's obviously the commercial side of this where people are looking at the data sets in order to understand the outcomes of, you know, purchasing behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. But I also wonder, like, at what point, like, do we as individuals start collecting those data sets in order to like observe the observer, right? In order to kind of take on that surveillance role, right? Like, when do we actually start using data as individuals and start looking at the serendipity of the data that actually already exists in order to understand better the systems that we're fitting into? And that's really come up through this conversation. It's like this notion of data surveillance, because we've had this Stephen Mann at University of Toronto. He's the one who made that term, right, surveillance, right? Yeah. We have like cameras everywhere, so there's surveillance happening everywhere. And so actually we should be carrying cameras ourselves, but in effect we are. Right. Like we are, like there's a log of data that we're collecting ourselves and we're just not using, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too with like Facebook or whatever, or like these apps that lets you download your data, and it's like, it's useless by myself. Like I made it, I fucking know. Give me the whole data set that you're working with so I can do something interesting.
And yet that's like where Facebook has like, you know, recently been getting itself more in trouble, is like people are starting to recognize like, hey, I'm looking at the data set of what I'm receiving and it's suspect, you know, there's something wrong with it. You know, where else is that happening?
Yeah, plus there's like, it's funny with a lot of these examples, there's this odd thing that it's like, well, once it's been published, like, I don't know how valuable it is anymore if everybody knows that something like the grammar one or the browser thing is a good indicator of who should get the front office or corner office job or whatever.
Here's another random one from that list. Smart people like curly fries. Liking curly fries on Facebook is predictive of high intelligence.
It's an indicator of bad taste.
like what do you do? What do you do with things like that? And that was actually a study done by Cambridge and Microsoft Research. Like, where are these things coming from?
McCain. You see a darker side to any of this, that like some of these things, even just becoming aware of some of these weird things, changes society and shapes us in ways that it might not be so pleasant?
Yeah, like obviously, again, going back to like the corporate side of things, but then even like, you know, you look at government and policy making and the ways that, or these like serendipitous observations can actually be used to usurp our behavioral patterns and actually like, you know, inform us to behave in a certain way that would not necessarily be our natural mode, and obviously like that's come up with Facebook, but I do wonder, like I do have a lot of curiosity around every aspect of our lives where that comes up and where that's at play. And again, that's like why I asked the questions, like what are the serendipitous data sets that we're not aware of that are already being applied in our lives? Because there's no way that they aren't. Like there's just no way that they aren't.
All right, let's go quick signal noise, Erica.
I feel like this is what like the pushback for like general intelligence is, like larger neural networks, larger trained data sets probably sold to larger companies. Term serendipitous data is super evocative to me, just because like this undertone or this underlying piece to whatever those those trained networks or those data sets are. And I think it's something to look a little deeper in, because there is this like almost noise layer that like people are actually tuning into. So yes, signal.
Push you down for signal. Yeah. Fathers, signal and noise for you.
Like, I think it's undeniable that like all of this stuff, like graph theory, topology, all of these like ways of like mathematizing social relationships is like fundamentally new and bizarre and weird and could be interesting. I think without what I mentioned before, like the conceptual model or like the what's going on story, like Irwin, that example of like curly fries and intellect, I'm just like, yeah, well, it's just like obviously like it's not that interesting or something like that. Like there's obviously no causation between the two. But I think the example that you brought up, or that Irwin brought up at the beginning of like babies and what they're saying, that got me really excited. I was like, oh my God, like what we could have so much interesting like developmental insight. But I think that maybe was just like the sheer fact that we're sensing stuff that we weren't sensing. And it's not really the fact that we're collecting data across instances, although maybe it's both. So in the maybe literal noise, in the sense of like statistical noise, is like the risk.
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, like the thing that comes up is like what are we going to do with all this data? I'm most interested in like, how do we get better at finding something interesting and finding something like worthwhile within all of this data that's being collected, even if it is often for, the purposes of whatever, getting an algorithm better to use your attention or spend more time / money on something. But yeah, it'd be cool if we can learn more interesting things about people through it that's unexpected. So I'll throw down signal. Also I would say a very successful kind of like meta weak signal to bring in. Like that was very like signal noise related kind of signal. That's cool. Fathers, what's your weakest signal?
We kind of covered some of these topics, so it'll be fun to see it. As people were speaking, I was like, hold on, let's hold off on this discussion until we get to this thing. But in New York, they started this pilot project a few years ago. I actually didn't even write down what it was called, unfortunately, but it was about basically creating a sort of snitch force for people who are idling their cars. I don't know who has heard about this, but like a citizen snitch force
for car idling.
Yeah. And so what happens is that car idling, there's like a regulation, a law in place that if you idle for more than 3 minutes, it's a $350 fine. Cops like don't have the time to go around doing this. And so they were like, we're going to give a bounty to those who do this for us, 25% of the cut. So you get $87.50 for videotaping a car that's idling for 3 minutes. So I don't really know what this is as a signal, like what it points to, is it some kind of like libertarian outsourcing of all like public authority? Like, is this something that we need for a climate transition to actually be more conscientious of like other people's behavior and either shame them or literally
the surveillance, right? Like, come on, like, snitch upwards, like no lateral snitching. Like, that's like, they shouldn't idle their car, but let's not snitch on our neighbor, man. There's an evil company out there for you to snitch on. Like, damn.
There's like a 80-20 rule, which is like 20% of the people make 80% of the videos. It's even more extreme in this case. Like, it's a crazy power law. It's something like 20 people make up 85% of all of them. And these people are making $70K to $200K a year doing this full time. And they get in fights. People like are just like, what do you like? They know who these people are. There's all sorts of like weird effects.
What happened to them as children? Those poor kids.
Well, so apparently it's like it's one ex-cop, several attorneys, and a doctor are among the 20.
No forensic architects.
Yeah, yeah.
Where is it happening?
New York.
New York.
Where else?
It's a good signal though. And it's specific about that thing.
It makes me think of just like this notion of just like snitch tech in general. Like, are we going to, as a signal, there's obviously the specificity of it in this context, but then also like what happens when we zoom out a little bit? And like you said, like, are we decentralizing like these regulatory authorities? Like, and how is that going to work? And how are we going to start using our smartphones in order to spy on our neighbors? It's not great.
This isn't the way for the government to be creating a job.
No.
Like if you're going
really being tested, Rob.
Yeah, I don't like it. If you're a civilian and you're having and your neighbor is idling in their car and it's polluting your neighborhood, call the cops. Not because you're getting paid by them.
You can't be the authority.
Yeah, I mean, call the cops if you're not comfortable just talking to the person and saying, please don't idle your car. Like, which is, the ideal thing to do. But like, don't put everybody out there like spying on each other for little things. I don't.
So are they technically employees of the city then, where they're just, this is what I'm seeing the word is citizen reporting on violations? Is that like, how is that legal?
Well, it's the rewarding part that just seems so sus, but yeah, the payment, the compensation.
I hate this.
Is there another side to this? Like I obviously had a visceral reaction. Does anybody want to look at it differently? I mean, the thing that they are snitching on is not something that I would advocate for.
Like you sign up here, like there's an account. You make a New York City idling complaint account.
I mean, the obvious thing where this came up was like early COVID rules, right? Like we started to see this talk about all this like police chiefs being like, if your neighbors are having a gathering.
Well, like, right, which is like McCarthyism, right, at its finest too. It's like, it's just like, hey, who's the commie? Like, well, let's find out who the commie is here.
I mean, they created Ontario had a hotline, I think. Yeah.
For commies?
For 6+ people gatherers back in 2020, way back. Yeah.
Does not pass DIMS analysis. Does not pass.
It's called the Citizens Air Complaint Program. So it has some environmental like championing behind it, which is kind of crazy. And that's what you were mentioning at the beginning, Valdez, is that these people are trying to like stop vehicles from polluting.
There's like interviews with some of them, and one of the guys is like, well, I always like environmentalism was always really important to me, and then when I realized I could make like a buck on the side, it only kind of like catalyzed it further. I don't know if he's like retroactively justifying it, but there was a kind of funny, I think the overlap of what you would take to be like progressive and libertarian positions is kind of what I found a little interesting in that example. And the clear need to like change, I think, behaviors around like what's acceptable in terms of like consumption patterns and things like that, and not just leaving it entirely to individuals, but actually having like judgments basically about it, cultural judgments around like how much people consume.
Yeah, so I mean,
which is different than this.
Is this a signal of eco-fascism? Is that the?
I think you could call it something like that. I don't know if I would use the word fascism, but I know generally
I'm talking about the futures. Yeah, you know what I mean? Yeah, fair enough though. In terms of the like, yeah, the scenario.
It just seems like there's so many holes for like this to also become so problematic in terms of like people conspiring to like take advantage of something that's now paying you out to snitch on people. It just seems like there's just so many avenues of just it becoming a problem on top of this other problem. I don't know. It's just
like there is the other side of it though, is that like it really does become the ultimate deterrent when you know that every single person can enforce this rule. And the argument is made like I'm looking through some of the documents around it, and like some of the arguments are that it really is a public health issue. It's not just environmental, it's actually a public health issue. We've all lived in cities. Like if you ever lived in a building where there was a spot that people like trucks idled in, it really sucks. Like it does really, really suck when like a truck comes to do a delivery and they're idling outside your window and you're getting diesel up into your apartment and you're just like, I'm trying to live my life and actually being poisoned here at the same time. At the same time, like, well, people should just not idle their cars for 3 minutes. Like, 3 minutes is quite a long amount of time. It's not like you just stopped to check your phone for a second.
I think they should be solved by the carjackers rather than the snitches. That isn't carjacking coming back? Can't they?
It's very popular.
If you're idling your gas guzzler truck, like, someone can come and
New York will give you a reward for doing it.
Eliminate the snitching.
Yeah, they should actually make it like an anti-Russia campaign. Like, idling is pro-Putin. Like go back to the propaganda days. If you idle, you hate democracy.
Is it Japan or in China where like you can only drive your car on certain days of the week?
Yeah.
As like a solution to
that.
And you get like so half the population get certain days and half get that.
Depending on your license, you get like Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Does anyone know how that's enforced, or is it like just a kind of culture of?
Well, in China, it's enforced because there's cameras everywhere. There's literally cameras everywhere. So if your
It's just
car
automated.
It's pretty automated. And also, I believe there's a connection to your license plate as well. So like, there's just certain license plates are allowed to be out on the street on certain days.
New York
So
must be
very
like
obvious.
covered in CCTV cameras. Like, why is that not their go-to?
I don't know if that makes it any better.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, this is what I've been sitting here trying to think of like the opposite perspective of how I first react, right? Is there a way to think about this as like, okay, as opposed to having cameras everywhere where no one's really consented to these cameras being there. However, you're in society among other people, so you do know that people are around. Presumably these people aren't like hiding to get you, they're like, presumably it's just kind of eyes on the street, there's people around and they report if you idle your car. Is there a way to like look at this as like, okay, it's more of a community thing and people are actually rewarded for the labor of like doing this community policing, and as they should be? Like,
are they in that community, like these lawyers and doctors? Like, do they live in those communities? And like, what, like, my thing was like, where's the money going to? Like, who's getting the money? Like, shouldn't this be going back into like something that would benefit like air quality or like quality of life or like something within that neighborhood? Like, I think when you hear it, what irks you about it is like, why is this one person getting all of the reward for something that's supposed to benefit like an area or like, a particular like part of the city? That's what feels to me like a bit like nefarious about it. I don't know. It doesn't seem to be addressing like the reasons for it so much. It's just kind of like incentivizing maybe the wrong people to be.
What's the where question too? That's a great point you brought up there. Like, is there any, do you know anything about like where in New York City this is happening? Like, what clearly like this was happening somewhere where it was considered to be a problem, and that, you know what I mean? Like, whose neighborhood air is getting protected, or is it just a general environmental law for everybody?
I assume it's like a citywide ordinance, but I don't know the details.
Yeah, I wonder if it came from anywhere. Also, like, it's funny that there's like the exemptions here, and like, unless you're like a Brinks truck or whatever, and you got money to deal with, in which case you can idle because of the carjackers again. But yeah, getting it out.
That was the funny thing around, like, I brought up the camera like automation example because to me that actually strikes me as less like I'm less repulsed by it in the way that I am kind of repulsed by the snitch version. And then I was like, well, why do I have that gut feeling? Like, what is it about it? And I'm sure other people probably don't have that same feeling. Like, people probably feel George Orwell type Big Brother camera watching. But one of the problems, admittedly, with like the camera model would be that laws are not actually meant to be enforced 100%. Right. Like, they actually are meant to have a lot of like discretionary leeway. And so like a lot of the people who are like busted for idling, if you have an incentive to just like whoever it is, it doesn't matter if the incentive is to give you money, like you're not incentivized to use your judgment around whether it's like a appropriate case or not. Right. So lots of people who are out on delivery who like have just forgotten won't be cut slack in the way that like maybe they should be.
Traffic is in general such a great example of an area where like smart enforcement like is not a good idea. Like there are so many examples of times when breaking the law is by far the safer thing to do for yourself and others, and when you're navigating traffic. Obviously, like, I mean,
that being said, we do have channels, right? We do have channels for navigating that, right? You can go challenge it in court, and that's like,
yeah,
you know, the norm is someone who's speeding is speeding. It's not like they're speeding because they're rushing to the hospital, right? Like I imagine like 95% of the time, that's not what's happening.
Yeah, you're right. And hopefully us doing this work is thinking about those kinds of norms as well. So again, Valdez, it was 20%. What is it? 20% of people are like about this, like
well, it's a power law, yeah. Like 20 people, so it's quite small, make up 85% of the
like that. Gotcha.
The profits from this little industry.
20 people, that's it. Wow. So that's like really, of all the people who potentially could access this, like not that many are very interested in getting in on it.
Sorry, so it's capped, or it's just a handful of people engage in it?
I don't think it's capped. No, it's just that this has just been what's happened. If two people snitch on the same vehicle, I don't know what happens at that point. Do you split the profits? And then the other thing I was thinking, I was like, okay, if these 20 people are consolidating the profits of this industry, are they then going to like hire employees? Because some of them, one guy was claiming he had 200,000 that he made last year, or at least he was supposed to have, had they been processed correctly. That's enough to hire like 2 or 3 people, especially at like American wages.
Well, you would also think that like this is, you know, a great way of providing some funding to, you know, folks who maybe live on the streets and who need access. Like could you replace social programs with snitch programs? Like it's kind of this like weird middle ground of employment. Like Erica, I think you mentioned like that question, like, are they employees? Well, this is kind of like a weird middle ground of allowing people to work without them being employees.
I don't know if you ever like listen like early morning college radio or something, where it's like you just get like people who will come in and be like, nobody follows the traffic signs in the neighborhood or whatever, and they'll have like, you know, it's like town hall time, like everyone's very serious about it, and everything they're saying actually usually checks DIMS better than most other people who talk or complain about traffic when I listen to these things. But it's an interesting kind of community of people who care about that. But that's the venue to air out your grievances about traffic, 6 a.m. on Saturday. So signal and noise. Erica?
I think it's a signal. And that's because, just the government employing this type of incentivization. Like we talk about what government incentivization could look like often. And I think that this really lends to like needing some like kind of like guidance ethics, some like principles around what that looks like socially within a community, especially when it comes to surveilling a community in a certain fashion. They probably could have either whatever council implemented that probably could have used a little more like context and preface on how that transpires, and kind of a lot of the problems we've brought up just now. So I think it's a signal and really weird way of thinking of incentivization in a community.
Yeah.
And it brought up a lot of like very visceral feelings and immediately from all of us. So it's something to note too.
We all got told on in elementary school, like never let it go. Yeah. Irwin, for you, signal and noise?
Definitely signal. I can't get over just this expansion of surveillance and almost like this co-opting of like what should be surveillance into surveillance.
Snitch up.
And that's like snitch up. So as a signal for kind of snitch tech.
It's a signal. I think Valdez, this was like a really good like singular like instance, very simple, dense, rich signal with like lots in it. And then I also am feeling just like what's the signal and how I felt about it immediately. I'm like trying to, I don't know, there's a lot in it I'm trying to still deal with. So I like that a lot as a signal.
I also wonder if who kind of forefronted the initiative. Like, is this something that the community asked for, or if it was just something that was implemented because there was this problem where they didn't have the resources or the people to kind of do the patrolling of idling vehicles on hand. So they just created this model of like co-op of people, a random co-op of people who are going to do that work for them. Whether it was actually came from something that like a neighborhood or the state of New York really wanted, I'd be curious to know more about that as well.
Could have been the rights of the New York skyline to be free of smog and noise pollution. So what about that? Jared, signal noise?
I think it's a signal. I just maybe like a continuing signal of this kind of like snitch surveillance. Yeah, surveillance, like just, and I think we just need to get better at talking to individuals again and voicing our opinions on a one-to-one scale.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like, where does it lead? There's like a little part of me that's just like, we need just like to be an adult and not, do these horrible behaviors. So like, is this what it takes? Like, is this what we have to do to get people to stop acting away? I don't know. But yeah, the long term, like, does this lead to something like eco-fascism? Like, is scary, and I think it's part of that initial thought for me, anyways. It worried me. Broadcast from later. What's your weakest signal?
DALL-E 2 is this machine learning tool that creates realistic images out of text.
I don't think these like machine learning models have anything in terms of generating novelty.
This notion of serendipitous data.
I feel like this is what like the pushback for like general intelligence is, like larger trained data sets probably sold to larger companies.
A sort of snitch force for people who are idling their cars.
I think they should be solved by the carjackers rather than the snitches.
Does not pass DIMS analysis. Does not pass.